Good Vach, good Yar. I hope you all had a beautiful, uplifting, especially Yom Kippur. We are going to catch up for those who were not in there in person. Lamed in person, Lamed Ches Lamed Aleph. I might be stumbling over my words a little bit, but that's okay. So says the Gemara, Chalos Todo Kigim Nazir 38a3, Lamed Ches Lamed Aleph, all the way in the bottom of the page with the two dots. Chalas Toda or Kiki Nazir. So a toda, a carbon toda is an offering that's brought when a person has something magnificent happen to them and they're saved from something, and they bring many loaves of bread. Those breads are not chametz. They are not chametz, okay? And wafers of a nazir. A nazir, a person after goes through a naziris, they bring an offering, and with that they have certain bread, certain wafers. Those are also not chametz. So one could have thought that one should be able to fulfill their obligation of matzah with something that was made for a carbon toda or something that was made for a nazir. And the Gemara is going to, and the Mishnah told us that you can't. And the Gemara now wants to understand, where does this come from? Where's the source for this? Amar Rabba, Amar Kra, the pasuk says, you should safeguard the matzos. Matzah hamishtameres l'shem matzah. Matzah that was made, that was guarded from becoming leavened for the sake of matzah. Yatzazo shemishtameres l'shem matzah. Over here, although you guarded it to make sure it wasn't leavened, but it wasn't for the sake of making matzah. Rather, l'shem zevach was made for the sake of an offering. This idea that we do things l'shem mitzvah matzah. If you ever go to a matzah baking factory, they yell this every once in a while. They say l'shem mitzvah matzah because they want to remember that they're doing this for the sake of matzah, not for another reason. Over here too, if you're doing it for the sake of a carbon, you're doing it for the sake of a carbon toda, you're doing it for the sake of a nazir, then you do not. That would not work because it has to be ushmartim as a matzah. So you have to be safeguarding it specifically for the mitzvah of matzah. Rav Yosef Omar Krav Yosef just says a different source. Shivas yam matzos tochila for 7 days you eat matzos. Matzah nechel so shivas yamim. Matzah that's eaten for 7 days. Yatzah zazo she'ena nechel so shivas yamim. As opposed to these breads, the loaves of a toda offering and the wafer of a nazir's offering, which are not eaten for 7 days. They are only eaten for yom v'layla for 1 day and for 1 night. Okay, so those are two possible sources. It's ironic if you remember in the last Gemara we saw Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef were not in the front row. Remember, they were in the back row, and they were not as, so to speak, prestigious. They were not, appreciated as much. They were not so elevated. But now we see that they grew. Ultimately, they became great leaders of Klal Yisrael. Okay, Tani Kavas de Rabba, Tani Kavas de Rabbi Yosef. We have a brayso which supports each view. Tani Kavas de Rabba, Yachal Yatsa Yetze Adam Yichavasa B'Chas Toda Kiki Nazir. Person, you may have thought that person fulfills his obligation with the loaves of a Toda offering and wafers of a Nazir's offering. Tamalomar Shmartim Matzos. Pasuk says you should safeguard the matzos. Matzah that is guarded for the sake of matzah, as opposed to these, which are not being guarded for the sake of the mitzvah matzah. El l'shom zevach, for the sake of an offering. Tani Kavas Rabbi Yosef, Yachal Yetze Adam Yechavasa B'Chas Toda Kiki Nazir. You may have thought that a person fulfills their obligation with the loaves of a toda and the wafers of a nazir. Tamalomar Shivas Yam Matzos Tochel. Over 7 days you should eat matzos. Matzah Nechlas Shiva Yatzo Shema Nechlas Shiva El Yom Echad. Okay, so the same brisa, same teaching, but now we have a brisa that supports each one of these views. Okay, the Gemara is going to wonder why we need these psukim. We really should be able to learn from somewhere else. Typically, lechem oni. The Gemara asks, why don't we learn it from the pasuk that says lechem oni? What do we learn from that pasuk? Misha nechal ba'aninos. Bread, the matzah can be eaten in a state of being an oni. An oni is someone again who, after their loved one dies, before the burial, that is the state of aninus. The matzah of a toda offering and the matzah of a nazir offering, that cannot be eaten in a state of aninus. Ela b'simcha, has to be eaten in a state of joy. So why do we need this extra pasuk? And our answer is remember, this is machlokas, right? It's that we read it oni, but it is written ani. So whereas Rav Yossi had Galili learned the fact that we say oni means from the word aninos, that has to be eaten, or it could be eaten in a state of sadness, to exclude anything that can't be eaten in a state of sadness. The Gemara is saying the Rabbi and Rav Yosef, for these two brysas, they learn like Rabbi Kiva, who said that although it's pronounced oni, it's read ani, and therefore we learn from there it does not. There's no exclusion about things which cannot be eaten in a state of sadness, but rather it comes the word ani to teach me that it has to be flour and water and nothing else. And Gemara says, wait, if that's the case, typically have a matzah shira. But if that's the case, again, Rabbi Kiva said it can't be matzah shira. Matzah shira means it's not just flour and water, and we know that these matzahs, the matzah that's used for the nazir, the matzah that's used for the toda, has oil in it. So Amar Shmuel bar Rav Yitzchak Reviasi u'mischalekes ilekama chalos. It's a revius. It's a quarter of a log. Okay, very small, not a huge amount of oil, and it's split up amongst many loaves. And therefore, even though it's true there is a little bit of oil mixed in, it's very minimal, and we don't consider that to be matzah shir. Matzah shir is when you really have this oil or wine or honey mixed in properly. Over here, it's just a small amount of oil, and therefore it doesn't take it away from being lechem oni. Amar Shlakish is asking more typically B'chol Mashavos, right? Remember, we had another pasuk that said that matzah has to be eaten B'chol Moshvos Seichem, has to be eaten everywhere. And we saw earlier that was coming to teach us that if there's certain foods that are only eaten in Yerushalayim, they are excluded, they are disqualified from being good matzah. So here too, since these breads, the bread of a Nazir and the bread of a Toda are only eaten in Yerushalayim, they're only eaten by the base of Mikdash, so it's not B'chol Moshvos Seichem. The Gemara says in Rish Lakish, so recall that there are, although we only had the base of Mikdash in Yerushalayim, there are a number of mishkans, a number of different structures that were built as mediums, like in between, when there was no base of Mikdash, we had a number of periods of time where we had these different mishkans, or different unique type of mishkans, which were built in different places. And the question is, what was allowed to be brought over there? And that's a big machlokas elsewhere. And so Rish Lakish says, so you see from here that clearly these food items, these types of karbanos, the chalos toda, meaning a toda offering, and the nazir offering, were able to be brought in Novan Givon. Novan Givon were two places where the mishkan, where we had mishkans, we had forms of a mishkan there. And therefore, don't tell me, right? Again, the question was, maybe it's only, we should be excluded because it's only in your, it has to be eaten everywhere. And the Gemara says, yeah, it could be eaten everywhere. It could be eaten outside of Yerushalayim because when those mishkan stood in Novan Givon, you're able to eat them there, and therefore it's not limited to Yerushalayim, as opposed to, let's say, Bikurim, where no matter what, it's only eaten in Yerushalayim. Even when the mishkan stood in Novan Givon, you cannot bring Bikurim there, and that's why Bikurim was excluded from B'chol Moshvos Seichem, but not the chala of Toda and Rikike Nazir. Okay, Tanya, Amar Eli, Sha'alti Yisrael Eliezer, asked Eliezer, Mahu sheyetzad mechalos Toda Rikike Matzah. Okay, he asked the question we've been discussing, can you fulfill your obligation with loaves of a Toda offering or wafers of a Nazir offering? Amar Li, Lo Shamati. So Eliezer said, I don't know. I don't know the answer. So I came and I asked Yeshua the same question. Amar Li, he said to me, Hari Amur Chalos Toda Rikike Nazir, Shasan La'atmal. If you made it for yourself in Adam Yotze Behen, you do not fulfill your obligation. Limkar Bashuk, we've made it to sell in the marketplace, Yotze Behen, you can fulfill your obligation. So then Eli went back to the person he asked originally, to Eliezer, and he told him this, and he said, Bris, Hain, this is like brising, it's like by the covenant, meaning this is like a way of making a shvuah, so an oath. He's saying, yes, absolutely. Hain hadvarim shenemar l'mo Moshe Sinai. These are the words that were said from Moshe to Sinai. In other words, he said, yes, absolutely, I affirm this is the right shot, this is the right explanation. However, there's another read of what he said, slight variation with a very different implication. There's another version of what Eliezer responded, and he actually did not say it as a statement, but he said it in shock. Brisain, Hain hadvarim shenemar l'mo Moshe Sinai. He said, by the covenant, are these words that were said to Moshe at Sinai? In other words, he was like, where did you get this from? You have to have a reason. So therefore he was rejecting it. The time am I, the Gemara asked, what is the reason? Amarabba, call the shuk. Okay, sorry, I just paused it, and hopefully I didn't miss any words. Okay, so again, so again, going back a few lines, yeah, the other version says that Eliezer said, like, what? This was something that was said to Moshe and Sinai, like, what are you talking about? You don't need a reason for this distinction. Like, if you make it for yourself, it's one thing, make it for a store, it's another thing. What's going on over here? So Mar says, yeah, the time of my, what is the reason? Rabba explains, if a person makes something to sell in the store, he recognizes that there's a possibility he's going to change his mind. Amr, he says to himself, if they're going to be sold for another person's Toda or a Nazir offering, they're sold. If they're not sold, then I'm going to use it for my own matzah. In other words, like this. Back in the day, you lived in Yerushalayim and you were a baker. So what would you do? You'd go and bake some goods and you bring them to the marketplace right outside the Beis HaMikdash and you say, oh, you're a Nazir. Any Nazir, Toda offering. I made these breads with the intention for a Toda offering, for a Nazir offering. Great. And hopefully someone buys it. But in the back of your mind, you think to yourself, well, maybe it's a bad day. Maybe there's no Nazir today. Maybe there's no Toda offerings today. And if that's the case, it's matzah. It's good matzah. And Pesach's around the corner. I'm going to save it. And therefore, if you made it for yourself and you made it for the sake of a karban Toda, or you made it for the sake of a Nazir, then you made it with intention that it's going to happen, it's going to be used for this karban. And therefore, you can't change your mind. You've designated it for a holy purpose. And therefore it's stuck. And therefore you can't use it for matzah. But if you made it, and for all the reasons that we said, and not just because of a holy purpose, because of all the psukim that told us that if it's something which is made for a Nazir, something which is made for a Toda, you can't use it for all the reasons we told you, fine. But if you made it as a seller, if you made it as a baker and you plan on selling it, then in the back of it, there was an implicit stipulation. There's implicit tonight that basically said, if it gets sold, great. If it doesn't get sold, I never really wanted it to be for Korban Toda. I never really wanted it to be for a Nazir. I wanted it to be for myself. And therefore that stipulation, that implicit stipulation works. Okay, let's start the next Mishnah about marar. These are the vegetables which a person fulfills their obligation to eat marar on Pesach. What are the vegetables? We'll define all of them in the Gemara. Bechazeres, besamcha, chavina, uva ulshin, uva mara. Those are all different types of vegetables. We'll see what they are in the Gemara. Yotzbehen bein lachin bein beishin, whether they are moist, meaning fresh, or they are dried out. Velo kavushin, but they can't be preserved. They can't be put in vinegar. Velo shlukin, they can't be pureed. Velo mavshalin, or they could be cooked. Mitzdarfin kazayis, and all the different types of mara could be joined together as a kazayis. That's important. A few things come out of this. First of all, the fact that you need to have a kazayis for mara, right? In other words, whereas when it comes to matzah, when it comes to Karban Pesach, there it talks about having to be a kazayis. So it talks about achila, and achila is a kazayis. When it comes to mar, it doesn't say anywhere explicitly that it's a kazayis. Many understand that since it's juxtaposed to matzah has to be a kazayis, so too mar has to be a kazayis. Okay, that's number one. The other thing you have to know that the Mishnah says explicitly is that it could be combined together. In other words, you could have a little bit of like horseradish, you could have a little bit of celery, romaine lettuce, and if together they equal a kazayis, that is okay. But you have to have a kazayis. You have to know what a kazayis is. But it doesn't have to be of one thing. It could be joined together at different things. There's a very interesting debate as to this kazayis. Is it needed only for marar or also for korech? There are different opinions. Some say, different opinions. Ideally, we try to have a kazayis for marar by korech, but there are those who are lenient. Okay, if you have some mikelach shalahen, you could use the stalk as well. Uvidemai, you could use demai to fulfill your obligation with marar. We spoke about this earlier. Meiser rishon truma. You could also use meiser rishon when the truma has been separated. So again, you give the kohen his portion. That's the truma. Then you give the Levi his Meiser Rishon, that can be used for Mar, with Meiser Sheni Hekdesh Niftu, as well as Meiser Sheni, right? That is the stuff that has to be brought to Yerushalayim, and consecrated Hekdesh, and consecrated produce, Sheniftu, that you went ahead and redeemed it. So again, I go ahead and I make Mar, I designate for the base of Mikdash, and then I say, you know what, actually I don't want to do that, so I say, oh, it's worth $10, great. I go ahead and I say, take a $10 bill, plus I add a fifth, so I take $12, and I say, these $12 are now going to take the sanctity from the Mar, boom, it transfers over, and now I can take this Mar and go ahead and eat it. We will pick up, God willing, tomorrow. Have a great day.